The scene I currently have loaded in can be found in the content directory, scenes, project content directory that comes with the training. It's called Terrain Setup A, uh, Proc 1, basically procedural terrain, and the setup is fairly simple, pretty simple scene. Just have a procedural terrain, the camera looking down, basic light setup. The procedural terrain, if we just take a look at the fractal that is creating it, right click, edit the object with it selected, and under the procedural tab in the terrain editor, right click on the preview and edit the function. And depending on how familiar you are with the terrain editor, we get a nice preview of the terrain. Now, in this case, we're not really seeing a whole lot of depth. If we turn off autofit, we'll be able to stretch out the terrain a little bit more. If you're working with a terrain that has a very high amount of gain, or a fractal, in this case, we'll just go ahead and take a look. What I have, we'll close out the output observer, we'll come back to that. Just a terrain fractal, which can be added in if you click basically anywhere to get a little highlighted red box showing the placement of whatever node you add in next. And there's a couple of different ways to add in nodes. Over on the left, we have the fractal node. If we add that in, since I already had a terrain fractal within the function, it's automatically going to duplicate the previous fractal that was selected. If you switch it, go to basic repeater and back to terrain fractal, it'll go back to the default settings. Another way you can add in is to click once again, and you can right mouse click, go to fractal node, and then you can select terrain fractal. Pretty straightforward. And then connecting that to the altitude, which is the output, number-based output controlled by a vector. And if you take a look at the settings, fairly simple. Billows, a high bump surge, fairly small lowest or largest feature, the metascale being quite a bit larger. The nodes you see on top, the matrix transformation, and the add plus the constant vector, these were added in because I was originally working with a parametric or object-based coordinate system. If I go ahead and just click OK, the mapping mode under altitude production currently set to world. Whenever you change the mapping mode, what V will do is it'll ask you if you want to preserve the current geometry, the current position, scaling of the fractals, in order to change the mapping mode. And if you click yes, what it'll do is add in that matrix transformation and add. And what it is doing is modifying the vector to match the object scale that we originally had. So the scale was based on an object, and now it's a world-based coordinate system. So I can scale the terrain, move it around in the scene, make it larger, and not lose the detail or any of the mountain ridges, peaks, part of the fractal, those won't move. So if we need to expand the terrain, make it a little bit larger, we won't lose any of the detail that's currently there by scaling it, unless we scale it on the z-axis or the up and down axis, which would make it a little bit larger, a little higher, which would in fact change the shape of the terrain. So if I decide to move the camera to the left, what would happen, since the terrain is pretty confined to the space I currently have where the camera is showing, all I would need to do is either move the terrain within view, the camera view, or just stretch it out a little bit, scale it on the X and the Y, and an overall scale change of the terrain will not affect the Z as of version 7. If we go back to edit the function, you can open the output observer in the upper right. Now, I was saying before, if you end up with a terrain or you're using a fractal that has a high amount of gain, where the output is higher than a value of 1. And next to the output observer is the function node preview. By selecting an output, what you can do is view the terrain altitude or the fractal output altitude, which is typically a value between 1 and -1. So if you extend beyond that range, then sometimes your terrain in the output observer will be clipped or get cut off. So then you go to the auto fit mode, which will base the overall altitude relative to the size or the scale of the terrain itself or the object in the scene. Now, in this case, it's still really flat. So what you can do is turn on only when saturating, and then turn it off right away. And then it'll give you a more dramatic look at the terrain. And you can see it's a little bit different than it was before with just having autofit off. So that's one little trick you can do, is just to turn that on and off to kind of switch around the terrain. But a fairly basic terrain overall. And if we take a look at the material, there's 3 layers. The underlying layer is the large scale rock preset, slightly modified, the one that comes with view within the material layers. If we go ahead and open to load in a material, you can see that large scale rock located in material layers. I have a grass that I had modified, and that is the next layer. What I did with this one was make it more of a brownish color. And if you take a look at the environment tab and then the next layer, what we're going to see is a slight change between slope range and the altitude. So what I have is kind of some dead grass or darker grass around the rim of where the grass layer is showing. So if I just do a quick preview render, you can see where those 2 layers are, or all 3 really. You can see the large scale rock, and then the next layer is that brown kind of grass. And because of the slope range change, and just having a little bit of an offset, what it did was create a little rim around it. So as it's starting to go up the rocks, it starts to change color and kind of creeps in. So just a basic setup, just using the environment tab options. Now, these materials wouldn't be something I'd want to stay with entirely throughout the scene. It's really more there as an underlying layer and as a reference to build off of, because my main focus here is compositing and matte painting type techniques, even though we're not going to be confined to one specific camera position. So what I did was I just kind of created a general sense of what I would like it to look like, and then I'm going to be using some real images to make the grass look better, primarily changing the grass to make it look better, rather than rendering out an entire ecosystem of grass. But what I want to show you now is how we can use the camera projection so that we don't have to keep a procedural terrain. There's a couple of things about procedural terrains, and basically when we go to render, it's going to calculate the geometry and all the polygons needed depending on how close the camera is. And as we move through the scene, it'll generate more and more geometry to fill in what areas haven't been calculated. Procedural terrains take longer to render than standard terrains. If you're using a version of Vue before 7.5, you're using version 7 or version 6, then what you'll notice is when you go to render, and we'll just go ahead and do a final render. I've got this set up to 3000 by 3000 at the moment. What I want to do is just turn off some of these options, and I'll go into that a little bit later, exactly how we're going to be applying some of these techniques. We'll just do 600 by 600 for now, and render this out. And right now it's going fairly quick. for the most part, but a standard terrain is really going to render a lot faster. And another thing is the material takes longer to render because of its complexity. The more layers you have, the longer it'll take to calculate that information, especially when using or having excessive use of the environment tab, which I tend to do, just because it is a really, really useful way to control distribution of materials and also ecosystems. Now, as it's rendering, what it's doing is calculating the geometry. In previous versions of Vue, it would only use one core of your processor. So if you've got quad core or an 8-core processor, it would only use one. So using a very small percentage of your processor to calculate that information, which can take a lot longer. Now granted, with the newer version of Vue and with later versions, that calculation is done with all of your CPUs, provided you're using a 64-bit version. And it does go a little bit faster. This ended up rendering a little bit faster because I already have some of the information stored in my memory. First render would have been a little bit longer since I had rendered this before I started recording. Then it was a lot faster. First pass usually a little bit longer. If it needs more information, it calculates it. For the most part, procedural terrains can have a few issues. One is flickering. Depending on the fractal, if we take a look at the fractal that's creating, one option is roughness. The roughness amounts, which are pretty much needed, often cause flickering in animation. And you can adjust the smallest feature, which is basically going to smooth out the finer details the larger that amount is. But in doing so, you lose some of the definition. And for a fast-moving scene, you can usually get away with it, provided there's not too much of the terrain near the horizon, and provided you have the correct render settings. But there are more efficient ways to deal with procedural terrains. And in other training, I've showed a few techniques. One was taking the bump, or basically the fractal that I used to generate the terrain, to overlay and connect to the bump channel, which would in turn create a vast amount of detail on the bump channel on a standard terrain created from a procedural. But that also would have the same problem with animation, and also could take longer to render because it is calculating that bump. As of version 7.5, a new camera projection node is added, and if you own Snowflake, version 2.0, which is the meta node collection I created, the AntiAliasing Snowflake, Vue meta node collection, then you can load in Matte Painter and access the camera projection node in previous versions of Vue. So if you're a 7.0 user and you own Snowflake, you can access the camera projection node even though it's supposed to only be available for 7.5. And can even work in free versions of Vue like Pioneer. But what we can do with this is take the camera's position and render out a frame and project it onto the terrain. So there's no need to render the material. If you want to keep a procedural terrain, you can. Either way, it's going to be faster because you don't have to render the material. One of the techniques we're going to be looking at is converting this procedural terrain over to a standard terrain and projecting the detail on. And then building from there, where you'd be able to add an ecosystem on top of that, render that out, project that, and even take the multipass and separate the layers. Most of the compositing won't be doing directly in Vue, although it is possible to do some of it, and actually a large majority of it. But it's often easier just to take out those multipass renders and work from there. So I have rendered out this scene already, rather large resolution, or a pretty decent size resolution, not extremely large. Close to film, but not quite. So it's a 3K image. 4K would be ideal for a matte. Let's go ahead and just take a look at that render. So here is the 3K render output with the multipass, where I've enabled several of the multipass options, and we can see in Photoshop that we have all the layers for everything that was selected. And if we go over to channels, each of the layers will also have a lot of the masks available. Now, in this case, some of the masks that were checked didn't render. One would be basically the materials, where normally we would have a mask for each material layer. In this case, it wasn't working. So that did not output correctly, although we'll be able to deal with it because of the coloration differences and really just kind of base the compositing off of the color, which is pretty simple, and what I was going to do anyway. Mixed materials have a little better of a tendency to render correctly when you're separating material masks. One thing I'm going to note is that when you render a multipass, it uses blending modes to create the image. A lot of these effects, some of them I rendered out, but really don't have an effect. Post-process didn't make any post-process changes. The atmosphere gain, there isn't any. There are some options, though, that we will be able to see. And what it's doing is using the blending modes. In this case, the atmosphere filter is set to multiply. And we have indirect lighting set to screen. And background currently has nothing. There's no reflections or refraction. So a lot of these I did render out the passes, but there's really nothing there. Probably should clean up the file and delete them. But we can also see the shadows. We can turn that on and off. But the main difference is, in the multipass, since it is using all these blending modes, the output will look different from the final color pass. So the color channel that we have saved separately, where I described in other parts of the training how you take the color in the alpha and also the Z depth. And if we just take a look at the render options, the render to disk, color, alpha, and depth, well, those, and basically just the color is going to look completely different. I mean, it's not a huge difference, but it is different because of the blending mode, and the way View compiles the image is different than what can be done in Photoshop, or what is done in Photoshop. So the multipass, if we take a look, we can see everything I wanted to have rendered, I have checked off, and everything that was showing up, obviously the masks were not working, but I saved it as a multi-layered Photoshop file. Since I'm not doing any animation with this, I don't have the G-buffer on. And I did do this as just a final render instead of a broadcast because I'm planning on doing post work on it. And there's really no sense in rendering in a higher mode when I don't have any other objects in the scene. If you have imported objects, anything like that, you really need to go broadcast or higher in order to get the anti-aliasing to look right. But in this case, we just have this procedural terrain. And we can see some of the other components as well. The specular channel, and also the diffusion. So there's a lot of different separations here. So right now we really just have these couple really showing everything. Go ahead and double check that these aren't doing anything. And I'm going to go ahead and delete those layers because they really have no impact. One thing I had mentioned earlier in the training when working with the z-depth was the distance to camera plane. This is the output that I got from distance to camera plane. Looks a little interesting. It's not exactly what is supposed to be outputted. As you can see, it's a kind of a stretched color pattern, which may be useful if you can find a way to control it. But for the most part, z-depth would work much better because this is kind of useless. Go ahead and delete that. I do want to note that the non-blended layers, actually pretty much all the layers, are locked, and we can see all little locks here. So if you need to modify anything, you really want to make a copy of it and then work from there. So if we take a look at the detail, we can see overall it looks pretty good. I didn't really have any super special lighting on it. I am going to turn off the shadows. And I do want to note that the atmosphere gain can be a little interesting, or the atmosphere filter. Because this material, I changed the overall color. Rather than modifying the material color itself, I modified an overall color. That has, in turn, been part of the atmosphere filter. So if I turn off the atmosphere filter, we lose that color variance and that overall color amount that I changed to the darker color. So this actually ends up being controlled within the multipass by the atmosphere filter. And you can really see a fairly dramatic change. And for the most part, I am going to be modifying that and just toning it down a little bit. Because when we project this back onto the geometry, we're still going to have a bit of diffusion and also some shadows. Now I do have the shadow layer turned off because the terrain itself is going to be creating new shadows once again. Now you may also notice that the shadows is linked to some of the other areas of the material and kind of has a similar effect to the atmosphere filter. So we might need to do a little bit of cleanup to just pull out the real shadows we want to get rid of, and not so much the material shadows. But there's also some lighting overrides we'll be looking at, where we'll be able to ignore the lighting and atmosphere. And before I go ahead and modify these materials, there's two layers I want to show that we're going to be using a little later in order to export the terrain, basically doing the same thing we're doing right now with the projected camera, but we have an XY normal and an XYZ normal. Unfortunately, Vue doesn't support normal maps, so we can't use this output back in Vue, but in other applications, and if we're using Xstream, it makes it even easier. I'm going to be showing it in Cinema 4D with Xstream. What we'll be able to do is map the normal maps to the terrain itself and have a non-destructive lighting. In other words, we can take this render and after we remove some of the diffuse elements and edit shadows and get a more consistent color, basically using just the material color channel, which is also what I'm going to be using for the map, we'll be able to control the diffusion and bump with this the provided normal maps, so the normal maps that come from the multipass. So that way, we can move the light anywhere in the scene and always have a really, really high definition render. It's going to look just like a procedural terrain, but it's going to render extremely fast. So it's going to be really nice. Okay, so the main thing I'm going to be using to start with is this material color layer, where we have just the colors of the materials, no diffusion, no specular values, no shadows, nothing else, just the color, which is a good way to start. We are going to use and start bringing in shadows and things like that just because we don't have that normal map capability within Vue itself. I am working on a meta node, but at the moment it's currently not working entirely. So what I've loaded in is just a texture map I created, a seamless texture map with a combination of a couple of different photos of grass. And what I want to do is just copy this, and we can paste it into the scene. And now it is a lot smaller. So what I can do is just holding down Alt and Shift, Alt to trigger the duplicate once I move the mouse, and Shift to constrain it as I'm moving it. And we can take those four, select the layers, Control E and merge them down, or merge them together. And what I want to do is create a mask. Since the material masks that we're supposed to render out aren't working, we can just use this color, the material color, and I'm going to create another copy to use to create this mask. What I want to do is modify this to give us kind of a black and white mask, a little bit of variation and some change overall. And I think what I want to do for this is use the black and white filter. So image adjustments, black and white. And there's a couple of different ways to use this tool. You can either click on the color, move right to left, although if you move too far to the right or left, it does scroll over. Or you can go to manually adjust the color. We can move it more towards white or black and really create a mask this way. So what I want to do is bring the yellow down, increase the red, and then green, which it's already part of. We want to move a little more towards black, but we don't want to create too harsh of a change because I am using a lower quality render, as I was saying before. So it is a little speckled, but I'm also zoomed out to 33% at the moment, so it might not look great. For the most part, this should be okay. I might be able to modify some of these. The auto mode is also sometimes a good starting point, but I like to go in and manually adjust it. Then what I want to do is I just hit Control L to open levels, and I just want to balance this out a little more. Make it a little more towards one color or the other. And it doesn't need to be perfect. I do want to stick with some of the basic color variation, which is why I have some of these areas blending back and forth. So it's not going to be a direct mask, not where you think directly black or white. It's going to be a nice little alpha blend, adjusting the opacity amounts. What I want to do is zoom in, and what you're going to see is some really bad looking pixels. It doesn't look great. So we do need to make a few adjustments. I do want to note that Vue's anti-aliasing is typically too low with all of the presets. And I normally suggest rendering larger and scaling it down, especially for animation if you're having flickering problems. Rendered about 30% larger than it needs to be, and then scale it down in post, resampling, course, that's not always a great thing considering the render times, but sometimes it's the only way. In this case, since we're doing work in Photoshop, and pretty much taking care of it in post, at least the original maps, then we don't have to worry about the anti-aliasing. We can just modify it. So what I want to do is go to Filter and Noise, Reduce Noise. Reduce Noise works pretty well. There are a few things to keep in mind. Make sure you don't have sharpen details on. Do not use remove JPEG artifact. It will actually create JPEG artifacts. For the most part, even if it is a JPEG with JPEG artifacts, it will add more. Kind of want to stay away from that one. The preserved details is the overall detail amount being preserved. Now, what it's actually doing is creating a little bit of a blur around the edges. So if we bring this down to 0, we're really going to see patterns start to show up, which tends to happen with some of the filters, like dust and scratches, things like that. So we want to keep preserved details and bring it no more under 2 or 3%. And I'm going to bring the strength down as well, so it's not a huge jump, just enough to kind of smooth it out a bit. And then I'm going to run it one more time. And then the next thing I'm going to do is run the despeckle filter. So noise despeckle, and then also go back into the noise and reduce the noise once again. If you need to make more adjustments, because what this can sometimes do is create some sharper lines. But basically, I just want to get rid of those little tiny pixels that are showing up around the edges. For the most part, this blend should be okay. It's very smooth, and if we need to, we can do a surface blur. If we go to blur, there's surface blur. Works quite well, although it does take a long time to process. So keep that in mind, especially if we're working on something an image this large. Large amounts of surface blur, which I typically use for creating bump maps on leaves, tend to take a little bit longer to process. So now we have this pretty much ready to go. I'm going to create another duplicate. I like to have several layers available in case I mess one up. I can go back without having to reload the file. It does tend to create very large files, but in this case that'll be okay. So what I'm going to do, Control A to select all, and Control C to copy, or go to select all and then edit, copy. And what I'm going to do is select this grass layer, and once again create a duplicate. Select the layer, go down to the bottom, select mask, and then we can go over to the channels, and we can see that mask layer selected. Go ahead and paste. Go back to the layers and uncheck that mask. Now, what we're getting is an opposite effect. So what we want to do is make sure we select the mask itself, and you'll be able to see it highlighted. I'm also going to hit M and just click to deselect anything that was selected and just invert it. So Control I will invert, or you can go to Image Adjustments and invert. So now we can see the grass showing up over the top of the green areas. We can adjust a blend if you want to keep more with the color, maybe pull out some of those elements from the original image, and just give us a nice little blend. And overall, it already looks better. Of course, we will be bringing back, like I was saying, the atmosphere filter and things like that, but first I really just want to take care of this color and get this dealt with. Now the rock is just a very basic procedural on it and very simple fractal generating the color. What I want to do is use real rock images in order to make it look a lot more realistic, add some detail. Because once we get into 100%, it just looks like it was made from a very simple fractal. And in this case, it's the bump that gives it so much detail. But I do want there to be elements there that are part of the color as well as the diffusion. So what I'm going to do is load in one of my seamless rock textures from Terrain and Rock collection. And if you own the seamless terrain and rock textures, I'm using number 44. And I'm just going to go ahead and Control A copy. Now this is a 16-bit image, and I'm moving it over to 8-bit, but that's okay. 8-bit should be enough in this case. Go ahead and paste that in. And if you get a message saying that the bit depth is different, you can just ignore it. So I'm basically going to do the same thing as before, where I just go ahead and connect those, and we can just merge those two down, and then connect those two, merge it down again. And it does look like we missed the top, so let's see if we've got enough definition on the bottom, or enough resolution, and we do. If you need to get rid of any tiling, I don't think anything's really going to show up because I am going to be reducing this a very large amount. One thing I'm going to do is just move this under the other material. So now we could have this rock underlaying and just underneath if you wanted to have it affect the other part of the material. But basically I'm going to be taking this mask where I can use the non-inverted version. And I'll just copy it as I did before, add a mask to this layer, go to the channels, paste, deselect, and now we're going to be able to see that rock showing up underneath. We could set up a blending mode, but basically I just want a little bit of detail. It doesn't have to be amazing, because the scene itself will take care of a lot of these elements, although some things you will want to be able to increase the detail on. Also keeping in mind that the perspective and the camera angle will modify the map a little, so having some of the stretching and the distortion from the original image can be a good thing. We can see along the left over here where we just have this tiny bit of a cliff. It is really stretched because of the perspective. Once we move this in here, it kind of covers it up. We can also go through blending styles and see if anything really kind of grabs our eye. If not, we just go to the normal mode and kind of tone that down a little bit, adjust the levels, maybe some of the other settings. A really nice thing too, since we're using masks, is we can apply some layer styles and really kind of embellish on maybe faking ambient occlusion, anything like that. What I can do is set up a drop shadow on this grass layer. I'm just going to go ahead and really make it a little more obvious. We can increase the spread and the size, and this isn't going to show up great just because I have so many details within this. So we'll go ahead and just use an inner shadow, reduce distance, increase size. You can choke it out, and this is going to be controlled by the mask, which is really nice. So that way, if you wanted to darken it around the rock, you could set it up like that. The drop shadow work basically the same way. And you could change color that way. You could do a glow, outer glow. So there's, of course, a lot you can do with the layer styles. I'm not really going to go into that too much. But if we just want to make a slight modification, I'm just going to use the default, just the multiply, and that's going to kind of fake the ambient occlusion around the rocks. We could do the same thing with the rock layer as well, where we'd set up maybe an inner shadow or a drop shadow, just to add a little more variation and something derived from the original image, since it does fit together well with what we already have in the geometry. Now we can already see something that's starting to look a little more realistic and something that's going to work better as a matte. I'm going to go back to that inner shadow on that rock and just reduce that opacity amount. And there we have a fairly decent starting point. So now I am going to save this because I want to be using it a little bit later for when I show you how we can use the normal map, because no other modifications would need to be made when using just the normal map in another application that supports normal maps. But in Vue, we are going to need to fake some of the details without setting up any special layers, although we could set up a bump or really kind of derive some things from the normal maps if we wanted to. Okay, so what I want to do is take the material color that we use to create the maps, and we can either turn it off or reduce its opacity to a lower amount, and that way we start to get more of the detail back from the render. And we also have some of these other filters that I do want to bring up a little higher. So we have the atmosphere filter, which is darkening some of the areas, and that's pretty much going to be needed to really pull out some of the color. Go ahead and increase the opacity amount on that. The indirect lighting, one thing I like to do is just adjust the levels. As you can tell, levels is probably one of my favorite Photoshop tools. Just because I really like the histogram as a reference. It can be extremely useful. So we're just going to lift that up a little, just changing some of those values. The shadows, I'm not sure if I want to really stick with or not. I am going to turn off the specular. And now underneath what we're showing is some of the other areas where we have diffuse. And this is locked. I'm going to go ahead and create a copy and just make sure that it is set to normal, because diffuse is basically the bottom of the material. So if we turn it off, we're going to see some missing detail. Shadows, I'm going to bring this up to the top. You can see how intense those shadows are, and whether or not I really want to have those entirely in there. I'm not sure I want it to be as dark as they are. What I can do is kind of remove these larger shadows around the edge, because a lot of this detail is going to be really important, because we're not going to be able to render that anymore after we convert the terrain. So one really useful thing, and unfortunately I didn't do it for this image, was basically to take the material and turn off cast shadows before you render. You'll still get the diffusion, but you won't get the large shadows being cast onto the other parts of the terrain, but you'll still get the detail elements. So it's a good idea to turn that off, because even though those shadows are already calculated, we are going to be adding more to the scene. And by doing so, they're going to create more shadows, and the terrain itself is going to create shadows. So what will happen is you're going to overlay shadow on top of shadow until eventually you've just got a black area in the scene, and it's going to be way too much to work with. So I just want to have a little bit of that showing up, and I'm going to create a duplicate, copy the layer, just set this to darken rather than multiply. And it looks like maybe that is not enough. So we will have to maybe use a different mode. We could use darker color, see if that pulls it out. But multiply, it looks like it's going to end up being the best in this case. So what I want to do is just bring in the opacity amount a little, then move over to the eraser, and just scale this down, turn down the hardness to around 50%, adjust the master diameter a little larger. Actually, I will turn down hardness, and just kind of go around the edge and remove some of those really harsh lines that are showing up, caused by the height of the terrain, not so much the detail. And that's what we want to get rid of. For the most part, there's really not a whole lot in this case. So in that way, we're lucky. With a larger scene that has a lot of peaks, then we'd pretty much have to re-render. In this case, tiny little bit of post work is no big deal. It's just a small amount of erasing some of those shadows. So it looks like we have our map pretty much ready to put onto the terrain. Just going to do a little more fine-tuning and tweaking. And now I'm going to go ahead and save it out in its current state, not as a Photoshop file. I'm going to save it as a TIFF file, 8-bit. I'm going to use some compression. PNG files work well, but with an image of this size, they do take a long time to save. I do not want any alpha channels or anything like that. When you're working with a large amount of these images, sometimes you just want to save specific layers out. So what I could do is create a duplicate. If we go over to the history, create document from current state, which is available in the history in this bottom button here on the left, and then delete every single layer we don't need, so all these other ones, and save it as a different file. And that way our texture maps and all that are saved, but we don't have these huge files, because this file itself right now is a little over a gig. And once you start creating more and more copies of that, more and more projections, that's going to become a problem. And that's also another reason why this image is not available with the training. Mainly because a lot of my multipass renders I have are more than a gig. Some are 1.5, some are even larger. And I do have another scene that I was working on, and I ended up with around 40 gigs of files with all the different projection maps from going from different angles to fill in some detail, which I'll be covering a little bit. First, let's go ahead and save this out and map it onto our terrain. So back in view, once again, save. Always save before you make a big change like this, because we're going to lose this entire material. So you always want to make sure that you have this saved out. It's going to be really important later when you want to start adding more detail And if you find out that you want to change this to an animated scene, and you need to create different projection cameras, move around the scene, and render new spots to work from. You can't do that with standard terrain or the projected map that's going to be on this. So if we needed to get this detail and back over here, we would need to face that camera towards that area and re-render with the procedural. So it's really important that you have this scene as the procedural before going over and converting it. So what I want to do is save this out, and this is going to be my B scene, which is going to be part of the projection. 0, 1. And I also want to make a note about the incorporate texture maps and compress file options. Don't check them until you get to the end of your scene, until it's finished. If you're saving incrementally and mapping different images over and over, what it's going to do is save the images with the scene. Not a good idea. Referencing them from your hard drive is good enough. Same thing with the content in ecosystems. If you need to get the file maybe off your network into another system, or you're sending it to a render farm, something where that content is not going to be available, then use the compress options and the incorporation of texture maps. But otherwise, if you're doing that for every single scene, it's going to take forever to save, and you're going to end up with a ridiculous amount of file sizes. So definitely stay away from that. The camera I have right now, camera 5. I had a lot of other cameras in this scene. I deleted them, but this is the one I want to stick with. One thing I want to make sure I'm doing is preserving the current position. The easiest way to do that is just to save it using this little save disk icon up here in the camera preview, and now we have camera 6. So that's kind of a backup. Another thing we could do is to create a locking meta node. Because I don't have that many cameras in the scene, I'm just gonna switch over to camera 6 and just use camera 5 for the projection. Now, when we're using Xstream and other applications, the active camera is going to be the one that's used. So if I move this around, I will have to make sure that camera 5 is active. We'll look at that later. I'm going to select the procedural terrain, right-click on the material preview, and reset it. So now all we have is just this very basic gray. Now, like I was saying before, you could just project that color onto this if you wanted to stick with the procedural terrain, just in case maybe you didn't find you had the detail you wanted. So in this case, what I am going to do is just copy the procedural terrain and paste it. So Control-C, Control-V if you're on a Windows system. Not so much of a Mac user. I believe it's the same on Apple systems, except you hold down the Apple key. Might be something else. I'm not quite sure. So if you're a Mac user, you probably know. I'm going to select the procedural terrain, and the material, because I reset it, is called material. I'm going to go ahead and just call this terrain rock. Click OK. Just make sure it remembers the name. I double click on the preview to open this back up. And what I want to do is edit the function to get into the material function, and we're going to just click and drag over the nodes that are currently in here, and we can just delete them. We don't need them. Over on the left, just underneath this colored icon, is the Add Texture Map node. You can also right mouse click under Texture Map node and add a texture map. What it automatically did was add the projected texture map. Well, we want to use just the texture map, which gives us the ability to extract the X and Y UV coordinate, texture coordinate, which is connected right now to UV coordinates. Since we don't have any UV coordinates and we want to use the camera, we were going to change this over to a camera projection. We can select our projector as camera 5. Now, another thing I want to note is that I did set this up to be square. Most matte paintings are typically square. It's a lot easier to work with rather than having to switch between ratios. And in this case, we don't have to make any other changes. So we can connect the color to the color output of the texture map, and all we need to do is just load in that image. And I do have bypass view browser turned on for scenes and images, which I think is a much more productive way to work. And that's so we just get the OS picker for images and scenes rather than using the view browser. So I'm going to select the terrain color, click open, and now interpolation types. This is really going to depend on what you're ending up doing with the scene. Bilinear is typically what you would use if you're going to be needing any sort of anti-aliasing. Since we've already rendered this out, well, it's just an image map, and it's a rather large one, we can set this to bicubic for now. But keep in mind it is going to be mapped to geometry. That geometry might affect the way this is going to look. So before I do anything else, because we do have some settings we're going to be looking at, I'm just going to go ahead with the projection, render this out. It is going to render faster because we're not calculating the material, but keep in mind, we are still calculating the procedural terrain. So in a sec, we will convert and create that standard terrain out of the other one. But already we have the ability to really improve the texture maps based off of the procedurals and create some images and some nice overlays for them. We can also add on top of that different bump maps and create a lot of images that way. Projection texture mapping can be really useful. So now we're going to move on and start taking a closer look at the materials, also convert that terrain over, and see what else we have the ability to optimize within the scene, really speeding everything up.